From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. The latest state jobs report is out today, and there's some good news and some not so good news. The good news is that Alabama's unemployment rate for August remained at 2.1%. That's the lowest it has ever been, with a record 2,259,025 people counted as employed. The not so good news is that the state's workforce participation rate is also low at 57%. That's the measure of how many able-bodied citizens are working or looking for work. Governor Kay Ivey has tasked multiple state agencies with increasing the workforce participation rate by breaking down barriers to the workforce. The controversy over content in Alabama public libraries continued this week. The Alabama Public Library Services Board met here in Montgomery, where a few dozen concerned citizens showed up to let their voices be heard. As we discussed with APLS Director Nancy Pack last week on Capitol Journal, the issue is books containing sexually explicit material and gender identity themes, and where such books belong in a public library open to children. Some parents and activists argue such books should be removed, or at least put in sections restricted to children. Others countered that restricting access to books is a violation of the First Amendment.
We are here just telling the board just a little bit what's going on in the communities all across the state, and we just wanted to make sure they were aware of the sexually explicit content that was in our libraries targeted towards minors. This has nothing to do with the LGBTQ community specifically. This has to do with sexually explicit content and radical ideologies that are being promoted to our young children, and that's all it's about. So I would just say go read the books yourselves.
Yes, I'm here to expose the truth behind the supposed book moving. That's how it all starts. It sounds so pretty when you say it's protecting the children, when really that's what it's being marketed as, but underneath is anti-LGBTQ plus community. They say that they want to just move a couple of books, and it's a common sense way to do things. It's their way of doing things. What they want is to be able to choose what all kids have access to in our libraries, which is a public place to hold information to teach us to not repeat history.
I do want to highlight, this is not a question about banning anything. I'm a strong believer in the First Amendment. I believe it's incredibly important that we respect difference of opinion and people's right to free speech. But the question here is not about banning anything. The question here is, should taxpayer money be used to fund books that may contain inappropriate material for children? I think it's important that we let children be children, not put necessarily the stuff in front of them. Parents still have access to it if they want to buy this for their children, but we don't want to have it in libraries where innocent children can stumble upon it without knowing that it's there.
Decisions on what books to carry and where they are placed is ultimately a local decision. But the board voted to create a database where concerned parents can submit the names of books they deem inappropriate for children, and that list will be shared with local public libraries. The Alabama State Board of Education met this week and voted to adopt a new testing standard for public school students. Known as the CUT score, third grade students will be required to score a 435 out of 780 on the state reading test in order to advance to the fourth grade. The vote was 5-3, with some arguing that the minimum score isn't high enough. State Superintendent Eric Mackey said raising the standards will be part of the process going forward, but that this was a good place to start.
Obviously, if we're going to, somewhere around 10 to 12,000, now all of them may not be retained, because remember they might go to summer programming, but still we're going to jump way up. There are going to be many thousands of students retained that would not have been prior to the board implementing this CUT score. And so the board has set a standard and said, if these students don't make it and they don't take summer programming and pass the second test, they're going to stay in third grade. Our principals have got to prepare for that. Principals have got to know they're going to have more students in third grade than they're used to. That might be moving some teachers from, say, a fourth grade classroom to third grade. It might mean that they have to, in some cases, reorganize a whole school district. So we have some K-3 schools, and that means those students won't be moving on to the next school. So it's not something the principal can do. That superintendent actually has to move units from one school to another. We are strongly encouraging principals, don't create some special class for just the kids who are not high-level readers. That's a bad idea, because generally what happens then is that teachers end up having to teach to a lower standard. We want to teach to a high standard.
Jefferson County may soon get a $158 million agricultural event center. The Alabama Farmers Federation this week announced the purchase of Hallmark Farms, a 500-acre property off Interstate 65 north of Birmingham. Alpha President Jimmy Parnell said the location will be perfect for attracting all kinds of events, from rodeos to livestock exhibitions, and it will offer educational opportunities for students.
It's a really pretty exciting project. This is something I felt like for a long time the state needed. We have ag is the #1 industry in the state first. And the ag people would love to have a place that they can go to and be proud of, to have events, cattle shows, rodeos, all of those normal things that you would think about on something called a farm center.
Today, September 15th, is the 60th anniversary of the horrific bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that killed 4 little girls and served as a turning point in the civil rights movement. This week, Congresswoman Terry Sewell spoke from the floor of the House of Representatives about the legacy of those girls and of the sacrifices made to advance justice for all.
60 years after parishioners of the 16th Street Baptist Church prepared for Sunday service, 19 sticks of dynamite placed by Ku Klux Klan members exploded. As the interior of the walls of the church caved in, over 100 churchgoers rushed for safety. Though most of the congregation escaped, under the debris lie the bodies of Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Morris Wesley, as well as Sarah Collins Rudolph, who was injured but ultimately survived. Without the influence of the 4 little girls, I not only question where America would be, but where I would be. 60 years after their passing, I get to walk the halls of Congress as Alabama's first Black Congresswoman. I do so because of their sacrifice and because they cannot. Their premature and senseless death serves as a constant reminder that every battle, every gain in the fight for civil rights has come at a high cost, paid for by the sacrifice of others.
Capitol Journal's Randy Scott goes deeper into this solemn anniversary, reporting from Birmingham in part 2 of his series on the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing.
We didn't have any hate in us because we was going to church learning about God, and His love. For someone to do something like that, they're led by the devil. And you don't put a bomb in a church.
September 15th, 1963, the quiet morning in downtown Birmingham is shattered by an explosion at the 16th Street Baptist Church. Sarah Collins Rudolph was in the basement where the blast happened.
They rushed me on upstairs and operated on my eyes, and when I came back to my room, my mother was waiting for me. And she told me that all the girls that was in the ladies' lounge with me, they was all killed and I was the only survivor.
She was injured, losing her right eye. Sadly, her sister and 3 friends died.
We came to church that morning to worship God, and had to leave there without my sister, and I was injured and my friends was killed. That was something that never should have happened.
Collins Rudolph says she's had difficulty talking about this event through the years, but adds she's gotten better about expressing herself.
I was mad for a good while, a long time, because killing those girls and injuring me, that was something that shouldn't have happened, and it happened simply because we was black.
The deadly explosion that rocked the 16th Street Baptist Church took place 60 years ago, where 4 little girls lost their lives in the basement of this facility. Today, there's a sense of urgency to help those dealing with post-traumatic stress syndrome caused by this tragedy. Birmingham's Bethel Baptist Church is conducting a conference the week leading into the 60th anniversary of the bombing. Named There's a Bomb in Gilead, the idea is to get people to talk about the tragedy.
But now we're realizing that to suck it up and move on is almost unrealistic, because when you have that kind of trauma that happens to you, it does affect you one way or the other. It may come out in ways that others recognize, or it may be internalized where there's self-destructive behavior. But it does not just go away. You have to deal with it.
Through our conference, There Is a Bomb in Gilead, we're offering help and support for all of the people, and not just them from that time period, but we realize that trauma that people experienced in Birmingham in 1963 is intergenerational. It doesn't stop because it happened to me, but what about my child? How do I tell this story going forward?
Citizens from around the country, including places also affected by tragic events, are set to attend, allowing the healing process to continue.
There are a lot of people who have joined us as partners. We're so thankful. The very first partner was the Minnesota Humanities. When we first introduced the idea, the state of Minnesota, the Humanities Department decided, yeah, that's a good idea. We want to join with you to do that.
Sarah Collins Rudolph says there's still hope things can get better 60 years later.
The state have changed, and we don't see all the color signs and and white sign up on the fountain and things like that. But it could be better. The state could be better.
Coming up next, I'll speak with Attorney General Steve Marshall about a number of topics, including gambling and the redistricting issue. I'll also talk redistricting with State Representative Chris England later in the show. And ADECA Director Ken Boswell joins us for an update on expanding broadband internet into rural, underserved areas. We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts. Keep up with what's happening with Capital Journal.
Joining me next is Attorney General Steve Marshall. Mr. Marshall, thanks for coming on Capital Journal.
Always good to be here. Thanks.
Well, it's always good to have you on and talk about some very complicated issues. I want to get to redistricting because that's really the big one that's very topical this week. But I wanted to start with a couple other things, beginning with this transgender ban lawsuit, right? The legislature passed, the governor signed a ban on doctors, prescribing, performing any kind of treatments on transgender treatments on youth, minors under 18. The 11th Circuit has lifted the lower court's injunction on that, but now that we have a motion from the parents in this court case this week. Talk to me about where we are in this case and what your office has responded to.
Yeah, and let me sort of correct a little bit of your question,
Please.
Which is, while we prevailed at the 11th Circuit, which, by the way, we're thrilled about and we can talk about, the injunction itself hasn't been lifted yet, which is, I think, part of what has prompted the filing that we saw this week by the plaintiffs. Because while we were able to obtain a positive ruling from the 11th Circuit that believed that the injunction itself should not have been issued, which is an important victory for us, and frankly is now the third in line around the country, which Alabama's assisted in being able to obtain. But yet, the injunction itself won't be lifted until the 11th Circuit issues their mandate, which has time that has to go through before the appeals have run for the mandate to be issued. And so by filing the request for review en banc, which means the plaintiff's lawyers want the entire 11th Circuit, not just a 3-judge panel to weigh in here, it has suspended the ability of the mandate to be issued. So right now, while Alabama's obtained what is a very important victory, particularly in light of the trial that will take place coming up in April, where we have the ability to be able to establish the very significant interest that the state of Alabama has in protecting kids from this type of so-called gender-affirming treatment. Right now, the injunction's still in place just because of that very specific procedural issue.
Well, respond kind of to the parents' argument here, because there is a tradition in this country of deferring to parents when it comes to medical decisions about their children. So I'm curious, maybe this is how the legal argument plays out, but where does the parents' rights to their children, parental rights, end, and where does the state's interest in prohibiting some of these kind of procedures or treatments, where's that line?
Yeah, the state's interest never ends as it relates to kids. I mean, we always have a vested interest in being able to protect our children. And so one of the things that obviously the 11th Circuit saw when we were able to prevail recently in that decision is not only is Alabama's argument here about the experimental nature of this treatment, why Europe has pulled back from doing this when the United States is seemingly charged well ahead, and for us to be able to outline why the legislature would have concerns and being able to weigh into this very specific area. The plaintiffs in their pleading most recently in the 11th Circuit with the en banc petition really have centered their question around parental rights. And what you saw the 11th Circuit acknowledge that the parents have rights clearly around the education of their kids, dealing with custody issues. There's never been this absolute right for parents to allow their children to do things that ultimately are long-term detrimental to their health. And I can tell you from personal experience, just in the work we've done on this case, that I've talked to countless young people who shared with me that during their youth they felt a certain way, that they really did want to be of the other gender, and they just realized it was ultimately just a really big mistake. And as a result of the fact that they went through this off-label use of medication through certain clinics that tried to transition them, they have long-term both medical and emotional problems that they're dealing with right now. And the reality is, I think there's a legitimate question of how well-informed parents are as to the experimental nature of this treatment as well. I think we're going to ultimately be able to offer evidence of people who went into a clinic and just sort of blanketly told this is what you need to do, never an explanation as to the risk or the hazards as a result of puberty blockers, and then making decisions without understanding that there are non-medical ways to deal with gender dysphoria. And so uniquely, I think this case is going to kind of sort of weigh into the very tension that you've described between the state's interest and potentially the decisions that parents get to make. But I think once we have the opportunity really to expose the lie and the fraud that surround those that want to do this to our kids, it's going to be abundantly clear the state's interest in making sure that we can protect kids.
Want to switch gears to gambling. Was talking with the speaker the other day. There's talk of legislation coming into next session, which will be here before you know it. There's sort of this committee working behind the scenes to talk about what might be feasible in the legislature when it comes to casinos, lottery, sports betting. But when it comes to casinos, the speaker was pretty specific because he talked about almost like this Wild West of, casinos being able to pop up. I described it as kind of you playing whack-a-mole. You shut one down, another pops up and everything. What can you tell us about specific to enforcement and the latest on that?
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that I would embrace this idea that we have it, so we might as well legalize it. Here's a couple of things I think need to be in play in the gambling discussion. Number one, I think the speakers acknowledged and others that our gambling laws don't create much of a deterrence. Well, that's an easy fix. The legislature has an opportunity to be able to raise what is now misdemeanor offenses and make them felony. And that would cause people to think twice before they would potentially open up one of these mom and pop operations. But here's the reality. The presence of these illegal facilities is really geographically specific. And let's take Jefferson County, for example. When Mike Hale was sheriff, we had no illegal operating gambling facilities, to my knowledge. And now you've already seen that we were recently up there shutting down multiple facilities We continue to be able to monitor what's going on and we'll be engaged. But when you have elected officials say, we're not going to enforce this law, then you've given the green light. And I don't think you need a legislative fix there as much as finding opportunities to require law enforcement to be able to do their jobs. The other thing I would say is just because you create a regulatory body around the issue of gambling doesn't solve your local enforcement problem. That to the extent, for example, we saw legislation that wanted to place casinos in 5 or 6 different areas. On those localities that have become the losers of those, how are you going to be able to ensure, and what's your mechanism to make sure that illegal facilities are shut down? So I do think that we can enhance the laws, that we can provide more resources from the enforcement side, but we can also change the laws to make sure that if local officials are not enforcing existing laws, that we have the ability to remove them from office.
A lot of that sounds familiar from years ago. Let's talk about redistricting. We reported on the 3-judge panel rejecting the map passed by the legislature and enjoining the state from moving forward with elections based on that map. You have asked the Supreme Court to stay that order, essentially allowing the state to proceed with elections as the legal arguments play out. So when might we expect a ruling on that? And can you kind of explain the stakes there, what their ruling, what no matter what it is, means and what it doesn't mean?
Yeah, a couple things in play. Right now, the request is very similar to the first go-around in these cases where we sought a stay of the 3-judge panel's order and in fact got that stay. It's what allowed us to be able to use the map the legislature passed in 2021 for the most recent congressional election. We now are making a very similar request to the map that was filed in 2023 in which the court recently issued their order. Right now, in both of the plaintiffs' cases that obtained that order, it's now in front of the United States Supreme Court where Justice Thomas, who is the 11th Circuit's judge and who receives that stay request, has asked for the plaintiffs to be able to respond by September 19th. Now, there's an urgency here for us in getting some certainty about where we stand because October 1 really is kind of the time frame in which our Secretary of State and his team need to be able to know what map we're using so that they can then implement what it is they have to do for purposes of this election.
Sure.
So as long as there's no stay, we're continuing to work as the 3-judge panel is requiring us to be able to respond as we've done this week to the maps that have been submitted and we've made a legal submission. But meanwhile, we still have that appellate track that is asking for the stay to be able to use the map that was passed in the most recent legislative session to then allow our appeal to be fully heard.
Okay. Well, no matter what happens, stay, no stay, you're going to appeal the ruling itself, right? That appeal is going to the Supreme Court one way or the other on the actual substance of that ruling. Am I correct on that?
Yes, you are.
So walk me through, I know it may be premature, but walk me through the basics of what your argument will be before the Supreme Court against that 3-judge panel ruling.
Yeah, I think the intent for that appeal is to be able to demonstrate to the Supreme Court how it is that the map that was passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, is one that responded to some of the concerns that we saw in the most recent Supreme Court decision. For example, the sort of fundamental principles that surround redistricting. One of the things that we did with this new map was that no longer was sort of core retention an important factor. In fact, that was discarded completely. Core retention being the existing lines, the historical lines, because that was very much a part of the 2021 map. And we looked to issues like compactment, communities of interest, that we weren't dividing counties and were respecting county lines, and believed that the legislature came together with a map that was not only consistent with those traditional redistricting principles, but also with the concept of creating an opportunity district that the plaintiffs have required. Obviously, the 3-judge panel has rejected that, but that's what appeals are for, is an opportunity to present those legal arguments, and we hope the opportunity will be given to us to do that again with the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. So, we've talked before about the different criteria the court laid out, right, or especially Kavanaugh and Roberts. They said many different things: compactness, communities of interest, but they also said, majority black district or close to it.
Well, and I'm going to start. I don't believe that the Allen decision actually said a specific percentage or seemed to sort of indicate what that is.
Sure.
In fact, I think that's what most people, when they sort of looked at the decision, have said there was no real clarity given with regard to what's the operative percentage. And in fact, if you look at the plaintiffs themselves, because remember there's 3 separate cases that are challenging the congressional districts, they don't even agree among themselves. And in fact, you've seen a pleading filed very specifically by Terry Sewell, who's serving in the 7th District right now, very much opposed to the approach that the Singleton plaintiffs have.
But for very different reasons. My question is, why not play it safe? I mean, 39, close to 40% is much different than 48, 49. Why not play it safe? And even though maybe they didn't say it as the biggest priority, it was said, why not play it safe and go ahead and do that, get closer to that opportunity level?
I think you've seen the numbers raised as a result of the plan itself, but that's not the only focus. There are also those other factors that I described that are included in the maps that also were something that were raised by the plaintiffs. For example, you see the Black Belt itself being contained within 2 separate districts, not split up into 3. That was something that was highlighted in the other litigation. That was a response of the legislature to this particular plan. But yet, there was no very specific percentage given. I think the legislature has tried to incorporate everything that they understood and saw from that case, along with their traditional responsibilities in drawing those maps, and I think they did the best they could.
Mm-hmm. There's something I've been curious about ever since that special session, as to your office's involvement, right? Like, why be involved at all, right? Sort of as of council sort of role y'all played, especially in the Senate, kind of advising all along. At least that was what the senators said, is that, kind of taking advice from the Attorney General's office. Why be involved at all? Why not sit it out and let them? I know it's your job to defend whatever the product the state passes, but why be involved at all?
I think when there are questions about the law and how it applies very specifically to the things they do, we wanted to be able to be a resource for those questions. I mean, it's ultimately the legislature's decision on what choice to make, where the lines were drawn, but within the confines of trying to understand what is the overlay of Section 2, what is the overlay of those traditional redistricting principles, and then conversely, how far do you go without potentially then being challenged for gerrymandering trial or claim that I expect will sometime come, that you don't go too far. And look, the legislature had a difficult position to sort of operate. And again, we wanted to be able to provide assistance, and clearly it is our responsibility now to defend it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I wanted to get to, actually, because, maybe hypotheticals are dangerous, but let's play the tape through to the end. And let's say, you appeal, we go forward with these elections, but the appeal ultimately goes to the Supreme Court, and they decide not to hear it, right? That's a totally plausible outcome in here, is that the Supreme Court doesn't grant cert, the appeal's not heard, and so whatever the 3-judge panel, special master, that's what is allowed to proceed. But if they don't hear the case and obviously don't rule on the case, doesn't that mean that the question of racial proportions in election maps versus 14th Amendment equal to protection, mm-hmm. Isn't that question still out there and still unanswered by the court? And another follow-up would be, doesn't the court still have to answer that at some point?
Can I say yes and yes? I mean, that in the sense that, and I think you point out, the tension is, how much do you racially gerrymander to deal with this question of creating a minority opportunity district? That's why the discussion of going down and grabbing population out of Mobile, because it's really a demographic question, right? I mean, as far as being able to deal with numbers. And let's not forget, although this case is challenging those congressional districts, the issues that are being litigated are applicable to a current case right now in Jefferson County with the commission there, to a pending case in front of another 3-judge panel involving our Senate districts, what is going on in other states around the country. And so very much the issue that you've described is bigger than singularly the one case that we're litigating right now, but it does impact across the board multiple cases in multiple states in dealing with this very specific question.
Yeah. So it might, even if they don't rule on Alabama or take up Alabama's case, it could be Texas, it could be Louisiana, it could be North Carolina. There are many states, just because they don't grant cert, or if they don't grant cert, doesn't mean the question is over with. We're probably going to be dealing with this for a while.
I think that's a very valid assessment. And again, one of the things that we hope the court deals with in our case, providing direct guidance on that front, but I can clearly see it coming in another case as well.
Well, a lot to follow. We're over time. Thank you for your time and talking through some of these pretty complicated issues. Hope to have you back soon.
We'll be back.
We'll be right back.
Montgomery native Percy L. Julian was an internationally acclaimed chemist. The third African American to receive a PhD in chemistry, he specialized in the chemistry of natural products and their synthesis in the laboratory. This technology is very important in medicines, food products, paints, and firefighting foams, among other things. Julian received many awards, including election to the National Academy of Sciences and the National Inventors Hall of Fame.
You're watching Alabama Public Television.
Joining me next is State Representative Chris England from Tuscaloosa. Mr. England, thanks for coming on Capitol Journal.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, I want to get to redistricting because that's a really big topic this week. But before we got there, I wanted to ask you about this kind of issue that carried over from Contract Review Committee last week. We covered contract review and kind of got a little heated there at the end about these Department of Transportation contracts.
Right.
You had Senator Elliott really questioning the department's contract that's going to go towards the West Alabama corridor, most of 43. Eventually asked to put a hold on it.
Right.
Then you came out and said, well, look, if you're going to hold up our project, meaning, a West Alabama project, Mobile, Tuscaloosa, then I'm going to hold up the rest of them, other projects. Two can play this game. I know y'all talked about a meeting this week to sort of resolve these differences. Where are we in terms of getting to a resolution?
I think we're still working towards that. For me, I represent part of Tuscaloosa County. It's a black belt area, and I share a lot of the same area with my colleagues in the West Alabama area. And this project is vital to economic development and growth in the black belt area. And, it's not like when I woke up this morning and I walked outside, this isn't Alabama. This is a Rebuild Alabama project. So the people in my district and many districts in that area also pay the gas tax that goes to paying for road projects. And they deserve to see this money come back and be invested in their area. And it sends a message to the country that if you invest in West Alabama, in this area, the state will back you. We'll put the infrastructure in place so we can start rebuilding some of the areas in the Black Belt that have, sort of withered away. And quite honestly, 43, which is what this corridor we're talking about, there are parts of 43 that are dangerous. It's not a good roadway. So at the very least, not only are we talking about economic development, but we're also talking about basic safety. So our money, my constituents and the people that live in West Alabama are just as important as folks that live in other parts of the state, and they deserve investment as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of the questioning I hear, not only from Elliott, but Lieutenant Governor Ainsworth, is about, all the pictures of 65 getting backed up, and we need to be expanding 65, which of course is a very long-term project. And the governor did announce a partial expansion of it in kind of Metro Birmingham. But that's sort of juxtaposed. They say, well, why are we spending money over here when this should be the priority? How do you respond when that argument is used?
It's Rebuild Alabama, or first and foremost. That's what's being spent on this project is Rebuild Alabama money, which again, folks in my area, folks in West Alabama pay that tax when they go buy gas. So again, they should see a return on that investment. But also, it's hard to tell an entire region of the state who have needs that theirs aren't as pressing as other areas. So, I understand we're talking about financing and so forth, but when you talk about the Bay Bridge project, which is $2.5 billion, or when you talk about the I-65 project, which is going to be billions of dollars, no one has said anything about how much those projects are going to cost. But as soon as we start talking about projects in the Black Belt, 43, now we want to pinch pennies. Now we want to see if we can afford it. And it sends a message to the folks that live there that they're just not as important as other areas of the state. And that's just not true. For me, again, if we're going to pay the gas tax just like everybody else, we should expect some investment in our area, especially areas that desperately need it. To this point, there are people who avoid going 43 and they go 45 into Mississippi. Also, they'll go alternate routes, which means that that's less traffic going to these areas, which makes it very difficult for them to, they're not spending money in these towns that are on 43. So again, if there's $1 sitting in the middle of the table and we're all fighting for it, we're all in our area going to make sure that our folks get a piece of that dollar too.
Let's talk about redistricting.
Yeah.
We are awaiting the Supreme Court's ruling first on a stay of the lower court's ruling, but we're going to have some court activity for the next couple of weeks, it looks like.
Yeah.
I've spoken to the Attorney General to get his perspective. Now I want your perspective. How confident are you that the U.S. Supreme Court will ultimately, after all these rulings are sort of dealt with, will ultimately agree with the lower court again, and that this special master will indeed be drawing these districts?
Well, the way we did the special session, we didn't really give the Supreme Court a choice, right? I mean, the argument can't be, after all your arguments have been rejected on several occasions by the district court and the Supreme Court, is to go back to the Supreme Court and say, we really meant it this time. There are no new arguments. They've all been rejected. And if the Supreme Court, in less than a year, were to reverse themselves, it would essentially reward Alabama for basically ignoring and defying a court order. So our actions in the special session, which in my opinion were outright defiance, you can't, as a Supreme Court, reward that behavior because everybody else will essentially attempt to do the same thing. So if we're going to have law and order, we have to respect it. We have to respect the system. And, you can't tell me as a citizen that I have to abide by court orders that I don't like, that I don't agree with, and then outright defy one when it's inconvenient for you. And I'm confident that, as the district court has said on multiple occasions how troubled they are about how the state just ignored and defied their order, I am confident that the Supreme Court will not reward Alabama's defiance by granting a stay and requiring us to use this illegal map for another 2-year cycle.
Well, that's certainly the way the district court, or the three-judge panel of the 11th Circuit saw it in terms of, they talked about that in their order. But there are plenty on the other side, Marshall and others, who disagree that that's what the Supreme Court said in their ruling. They argue that the Supreme Court never interpreted the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to mandate proportionality, right? Proportionality among the congressional districts, by race and population. And so that might be a big question as to whether or not the Supreme Court, if they decide to rule, ultimately, if they decide not to rule, and if they don't, could that question of proportionality still be out there? Meaning, could another state, ask that question, or will it be settled?
I think one of the things that the district court kept saying over and over again in Alabama is that you're missing the point. It's not about proportionality. It's about making sure that that African Americans, minorities, have the ability to elect their candidate of choice. That is a different question from proportionality, because we're not talking about a percentage versus the ability to elect. We're talking about if the map itself diminishes a black person's opportunity to elect the candidate of choice. And that is a different question. And again, it's one of those things, like, I don't know how many times we had to be, we as a state, we need to be told that, your argument is wrong, it's been rejected, it doesn't matter how many times you rephrase it, it's going to end up in the same place before we get the point. And again, I think just as a citizen, to know that the Republican supermajority used a special session to reframe and capture a losing argument only to defy the district court to once again present the old same rejected arguments to the Supreme Court in hopes that maybe they'll understand that we really mean it this time, or remind the justices that, we're all conservatives here, so give us a bone. It's insulting. And the fact of the matter is, all of us are at some point are expected to abide by the Supreme Court, abide by the law. When you have power, you use it judiciously. And this, in my opinion, was just an outright gross, just disrespect for the power that they have. And ultimately, it just undermines our system of justice altogether to say, I'm just going to keep defying you until I get the result that I want.
Mm-hmm. Setting the court battle aside, because we do have some new jurisprudence going on
Sure.
here, no question about it. I've heard some lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, lament that, these districts were okay for 20, 30 years, right? They were upheld not just by the Justice Department, but by the courts and everything else. And so what changed, right? Why did it change, and when should we have known that change? So what's the answer to that? Why was it okay to draw the districts basically like they are 10 or 20, 30 years ago and not now?
Well, because population shift. I remember asking 2 years ago when we were in a committee meeting, redistricting committee meeting, when I was told that, we drew this map with race off, without even any consideration for race, but it looked exactly like the same map, despite the fact that populations have shifted, people have moved, than it did in 1992 when it was originally created. Mm-hmm. So I think the more that population shifted in the
Does that go to the cracking and packing?
Yeah. So the more the population shifts, and the fact that, the map never reflected that, the black population now lives in other places, kind of evidences the intent that the whole purpose of it was to diminish the ability of black people to elect a candidate of choice. And then when you add to that the way that the special session went, where all of our voices were ignored essentially. We offered a map that was ignored. And then to get to the very last day and pass new rules and the new map at the same time, which captured, again, the failed arguments that had already been rejected at both the district court level and the Supreme Court level, it just evidences another level of intent to, I guess as a casual observer or anybody who was there, a different level of intent to discriminate and to make sure that status quo remains the same, which in effect diminished our ability to elect a candidate of choice. Mm. And so, again, I think it's just one of those things where Alabama continues to make arguments that just flat out miss the point. And, we talked about this beforehand, and, you didn't have to be Nostradamus to predict this outcome. Because if you see somebody who's recklessly driving a car around and they have an accident, does it make me smart to predict an accident is coming? And the way that we were operating in that special session created this outcome. There was no other way that this is going there's no other result that could potentially come from this. And it's just never a good idea to openly defy a judge, tell them that you don't like the outcome, and then expect them to change it.
Mm. While I've got you, I've got to ask you about maybe kind of going down the road a little bit. Won't be that far down the road. I mean, we're talking 2 or 3 weeks. But let's just say that it is a special master and that we get a map that has a district, maybe it's not 50%, but close to it in that second district. Let's just say that that's where it is. That automatically puts into serious play for Democrats a new seat on the map.
Yeah.
You're the former chairman of the Democratic Party. You had some success during the Doug Jones days, and but you've also seen maybe an erosion of enthusiasm or organization at the party level here in the state. Would having a new district, a congressional district in play, that's no small thing.
It is. That's right.
Would that maybe bring a bump of Democratic enthusiasm and organization here in Alabama?
I mean, it would certainly increase the resources. But you just have to stress, in order to win elections like that, in a district that's going to be drawn in a way that's almost 50-50, if the special master follows the district court's order, which I'm assuming they will. I have no reason not to think so that will happen. It takes building coalitions, and to build coalitions, everybody has to have an equal seat at the table. Because you can't ask somebody for their vote and their support, but then not value their opinion. So what I hope is, as you said, this new opportunity creates new coalitions. And that coalition between all the people who are willing, who are ready to work, who all have a shared vision and a shared goal for what they want Alabama to be, are all invited to the table to participate in the process. So ultimately, that sort of synergy that is created by that will then successfully elect a candidate. And we're a long way away from that right now. So I'm stressing, like, in order to make that work, in order to take advantage of this opportunity, everybody has to be sitting at the table with the same amount of power to create policy, platform, and also impact.
I think I hear what you're saying, and there's going to be some DNC meetings. Certainly, the DCCC, the congressional arm of the Democratic Party, is very excited about this, not just in Alabama but in other states. So this is definitely something to watch.
Yeah,
we're out of time, but Mr. England, thanks again for coming on Capitol Journal.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org.
Joining me next is Ken Boswell, Director of the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs. Mr. Boswell, thanks for coming on the show.
Todd, great to be with you as always.
Of course, people generally know it as ADECA. It's a pretty long name, but it's ADECA, the agency tasked with most of the pass-through granting in Alabama. We hear it so many times, the acronym. A lot of times lately, though, it's because of broadband, right? So much broadband work going on in the state, trying to get folks in rural areas especially, and some urban, connected to this high-speed internet. Your agency has been tasked with a monumental task of getting all this done. I wanted to ask, on the most recent announcement, y'all were down in Dothan, you and the governor, announcing this kind of rebranding of the program as Be-Linked Alabama. Tell me about that and why it was important.
Well, we feel like that the brand is very important. One is we have a great leader in Governor Ivey, and she has also created that connectivity with the legislature, with the House and the Senate, from the standpoint of the importance of getting internet services to the underserved areas of the state. So we felt like that it was very important to brand it. Not only that, but also under the new brand, it allowed us to do some updates to the website. And what it has materials that we have actually created, profiles of all 67 counties, so that citizens can go on and look at frequently asked questions. Not only that, but look at the map to show whether they are served or unserved or underserved, and how they can actually connect with their elected officials to hopefully get that broadband to their homes quicker.
That's interesting. And you talk about branding being important. I think it is, because as much as we've reported on broadband, both here at the desk, daily news, outlets throughout the state, there have been so many different announcements, so many different pots of money. You and I were going over it just a minute ago. So I'm counting the most recent, y'all announced $1.4 billion. That's from the federal infrastructure law. There was $182 million from the Capital Projects Fund here in Alabama. There was a little, $282 million from ARPA in that neighborhood. There was the $82 million fiber network announcement, I guess last year. That's a lot of different pots of money, and I may not have even included them all.
Well, let's just try to go through a history line if we can.
Okay.
We began in 2018, and since 18, we've had about $95 million that we have deployed with state dollars. 107 projects has been actually awarded, given a total of about 96,000 people and businesses that will have access to the internet.
That's significant.
It is, and would tell you again, it's been a very important connection, collaboration, if you will, between Governor Ivey and the legislature to get that done. The second round of money would be the ARPA $1, which was the middle mile project that we awarded to fiber utility networks. And they will actually deploy approximately 3,000 miles of fiber, affecting or impacting 64 of the 67 counties. The most recent dollars would be totaling, yes, $400 million. $180 million of it would be capital projects funds that we will marry with the $282 million with the Anchor Institute Middle Mile Program. We are estimating approximately 500 Anchor Institutes. Anchor Institutes includes schools, first responders, 2- and 4-year universities. So, and hospitals is very important as well. So we feel like by deploying that middle mile to those Anchor Institutes, it will allow us to be prepared by 2025 to receive that $1.4 billion for nothing more than the last mile.
Okay. Yeah, I remember you talking a lot about the middle mile, and you've got to get it out there because there's no way to connect the last mile, which actually goes to the neighborhoods and places like that.
Correct.
Without that middle mile connectivity.
Yeah, the best way that citizens can really think about this is you have dark fiber that is looked upon as the interstate.
Okay.
Then you have the middle mile that's looked upon as your state and county roads. And then the last mile would be the connectivity from that state county road into your business or your home.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that there is a challenge here in actually getting this money spent. This last legislative oversight meeting, your agency, but also the other ones with ARPA funds, ADEM being one of them. Because these are, at the end of the day, massive infrastructure projects that take resources, they take workers, companies to actually get done. And with Congress putting that 2026 spending deadline on it, you know, when they first passed ARPA, that seemed like a long way away. Now it really...
It's right around the corner.
Lights at the end of the tunnel. So talk about those challenges of actually getting it spent. And is there talk now about Congress or going to Congress to say, hey, can we get some help extending these deadlines?
I'm not privileged to any of those talks as far as extensions. We feel, and we have had conversations with the internet service providers, they feel very comfortable with their position from the standpoint of deployment and getting it into the ground. Naturally, workforce is always an issue as well as supply chain issues. But the internet service providers feel really comfortable in that they can get it after they're awarded and get it up and running within that period of time. Now, naturally, within our resources, even though they're awarded, they cannot get the money until the project is completed. Mm-hmm. So we feel like it's very important for us to be prudent on our behalf of spending not only state dollars but federal dollars to make sure that that internet service provider has some responsibility and pressure on them to produce.
Oh, sure. And like you said, there are only so many companies, right?
Correct.
There are only so many fiber companies.
That's right.
When you're looking at the other infrastructure things, there's only so much steel. There's only so much actual fiber. So,
that's right.
And every state is facing the same challenges, right? Because we all got the same resources. So we will certainly want follow-ups on those questions. That same meeting, the legislative oversight meeting, Senator Singleton asked an interesting question about, okay, should wireless be, maybe physical broadband can't make it to every single home, but is there a way to set up antennas and things like that to use wireless technology? Because, our wireless is so much more advanced than it was.
Sure.
The speeds are so much faster than they used to be. He asked, are y'all looking at things like that to maybe, amplify and get to those really hard to reach places?
The answer to that question is yes. We're looking at all aspects, but we are concentrating right now on the fiber, of making sure that we get it deployed in the correct places. Do we think topography will come into play? Geography as well. But yes, we will be looking at wireless as a source, but we're focusing right now on the primary portion of it of being fiber in the ground.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, it is like you said, monumental task. I know that y'all are working day and night on it. Thank you for coming in to share some of these updates, which we're going to be asking for because it sounds like y'all are really getting into the nitty gritty.
We are. We're working very hard. Our broadband division is working very closely with our consultants and our internet service providers. We are in that application process phase right now. Hopefully when that application process phases out, then we'll start grading and looking at who will be awarded. So it is a very, very busy time for ADECA right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks again for coming on. And just as a clarification from earlier, because it's actually broadband.alabama.gov. Okay, just want to make sure the right website is up there for everybody. I think it might be a great resource, not just for communities themselves, but for citizens to know, what's on the horizon and what resources are there.
Yep.
Ken, thanks again for coming on.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
We'll be right back.
Montgomery native Percy L. Julian was an internationally acclaimed chemist. The third African American to receive a PhD in chemistry, he specialized in the chemistry of natural products and their synthesis in the laboratory. This technology is very important in medicines, food products, paints, and firefighting foams, among other things. Julian received many awards, including election to the National Academy of Sciences and the National Inventors Hall of Fame.
That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week at the same time, right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capital Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.